Hi, my name is Dr. Karen Joyce. I'm the Education Director and co-founder of SheMaps. Now, I've been using drones for about 6 years now to map and monitor the environment, and primarily on the Great Barrier Reef here in Queensland. And prior to that, I've been working with remote sensing and GIS technology for nearly 20 years now. So over that time, I've made lots and lots of mistakes, or what we like to call failed learnings or flurnings. And in this masterclass, I'd like to share with you just 3 of my top tips so you don't need to come across these same flurnings for yourself. So let's have a look at 3 of my top tips for drone data capture.
All right, so just a bit of a background here as to why I decided to run this drone masterclass. So I got my drone license back in 2014 now, I think it was, and I had initially started to start playing with drones back in 2013, and there was nowhere near the explosion of drones that are available now. Back when I was looking at using them. And the main reason that I got into doing this, and I was working up in Darwin at the time, and we were looking at ways that we could capture environmental data for remote sensing. And one of the biggest challenges that we had was the satellite data that we were using was neither detailed enough nor frequent enough to look at the phenomena that we were interested in mapping. So there was things to do with mangroves, we were looking at fires and all sorts of other different environmental variables. And so one of the things that we wanted to do to address the fact of the satellite data not being detailed enough spatially was to look at aerial photography. And that's, aerial photography has been around for many, many, many decades now. But one of the challenges living up in more remote locations, like Darwin is away from a major centre, is that it cost $40,000 just to bring a survey aircraft up to Darwin. So just that mobilisation cost before it even flew the survey. So I started thinking, well, there has to be a better way to be able to do this. And so I was working with some colleagues at NASA at the time, and they were just starting to use drones for wildfire mapping in California. And I thought, I think that this is going to be a really good way to go for us to have that autonomy in terms of capturing our own data and being able to process that as well. So we went down the lines of looking at setting up this whole drone infrastructure and understanding what that meant in terms of purchasing the drones and doing some training that was required, and then of course dealing with all bits and pieces of software that we need to do. And back in those days, I was at university and I was teaching at a university there, and universities tend to consider themselves in this grey area in terms of what the regulations were with licensing. So the Civil Aviation Safety Authority here in Australia had the rules that you needed to have a drone license if you were commercial, and otherwise you're a hobbyist. And the rules are actually exactly the same now as what they were back in 2013. But universities like to think of themselves as non-commercial places. So we're not commercial in terms of when we do consulting, and we get tax breaks and all sorts of various things like this. So we don't say that we're commercial enterprises. And so at the time, a lot of the universities were saying, well, we're not commercial, therefore we don't need a license. CASA cleared up that grey area pretty soon after that, and it did become law that either you were recreation, as in your flying model aircraft, and it's just or it's a hobby, or you're commercial. So that put us fair and square. No questions asked. We're definitely in the commercial space. So I went down the process of get drone licensing. And I did my drone license, and fantastic training course, really, really enjoyed it. But walked away from that, I didn't feel like I had the skills that I needed to do drone mapping, which was really what I wanted. I knew the safety regulations, I knew what the Australian laws were, I knew all bits and pieces about clouds and weather and a lot of stuff, given that this was drawn out of the manned aircraft space, this training. A lot of things that I felt weren't really specific to me and my needs. And so then when I went on to train students, I needed to fill those gaps from what the drone license training doesn't actually give. And there's, it can't give everything, and that's perfectly fine. So doing the drone license is really good in one space, but in terms of mapping it just doesn't cut it. So this talk has really been born out of many years of what I like to call flurnings. So We don't call them failures because we like to learn from these sorts of things that are perhaps mistakes or don't go exactly as we are according to plan. And so we actually wrote a paper about all these learnings, and that was available online late last year, and actually formally came available in the hard copy just last week, which was quite exciting. And so what this talk is based on is just 3 of those main tips that I think are super important when you're wanting to do drone mapping, and they just don't come out in the drone license training. And it's a very good reason for that. There's just not room for it in the drone license training. That's perfectly fine. But here's some things that I think are pretty critical and what you need to know. So I work a lot in the fitness industry, and we have a saying in the fitness industry is that you can't out-train a bad diet. So that basically means that it doesn't matter how many marathons you run, you can't make up for the effects of having a bad diet. So if you want to eat the pieces and chocolate and ice cream and all that sort of thing, you can't do enough exercise to overcome that. And with this in mind, I actually apply the same concept to capturing drone data. And I would like to say that you can't out-process poor data capture. So here's what I mean. If you don't plan your data capture properly from the very beginning, it is really, really hard to get good information out at the end of your workflow. So here's some examples. So I work a lot on the Great Barrier Reef. So one of the biggest issues for me is the amount of glitter or glint that you have coming off the water surface when we're capturing photos of it. Now here's an example of a really, really poor data capture. So you can see over this islands out in the water here, we've been flying backwards and forwards and capturing photos as we go. Now, when we captured this data, we had neither enough overlap or side lap to account for the fact that we had so much glint in each photo. So when they were stitched together, we weren't able to remove those effects. So you can see both these horizontal lines through the image and the vertical lines as well. Really, really poor data, and you pretty much can't do much with that at all. And interestingly enough, although I'm going to give a lot of over water examples here, because that's where the majority of my work is, this effect is still apparent over land as well. It's just a little less obvious when you're looking at the raw photos. So here's an example where it was a little bit better in that we started capturing photos closer together. So the overlap was a lot better. We went up to 85% overlap instead of 65% overlap as what was in the first image. So what you can see is we've dropped out these lines that were vertically, but you can still see the horizontal ones, and that's a result of not having enough side lap. Okay, so then you move to the next data set, and granted they are over different locations, but here is the difference in making sure you get the right overlap and side lap, and also considering one extra thing. Here's my next example. All right, so you can see the glint on the surface of the water here, I'm sure. Now, there's a few different things that you actually can't tell is what is under the water because of this glint. But if you turn the drone around and slightly tilt the angle of the camera, you can make a massive difference. So these photos were taken minutes apart from each other. So there's absolutely no difference in environmental conditions like what you actually see in the above example. But you can see now that the image on the right-hand side is a lot better. And this is so critical when you're thinking about data capture and mission planning. And what I want to bring your attention to is this little spot here. So this is a ground control point, and it's really, you pretty much can't see it in the previous photo. Now this becomes important for my tip number 2. You need to get up close and personal. All right, so it doesn't matter that we say we use drones because they're amazing at getting us information in locations that we can't physically get to for ourselves, and that's true. But it's not enough when we want to get mapping, okay? So here's what we need to do when we want to make sure that we're getting the right information and outputting the right information as well in the form of a final map. And just a question popped up there, will I be making my slides available? Yes, the whole presentation will be emailed to those who've registered, which is obviously all of you lot here. So get up close and personal. Tip number 2, here's what it looks like. You may be on the reef, you may be out and about, it doesn't matter where you are, you actually need to get out and check the environment. So there's two ways that this is super important. Okay, so let's take the right-hand side image, for example. This is Dr. Javier Leon from the University of Sunshine Coast, and he's got these little markers that he's put out there out on the sandy beach, and we're going to fly the drone over the top, so we'll see these markers in our imagery. Now he's GPSing that location. The reason why this is critical, and this has got nothing specific to do with the reef environment at all, it's wherever you're working, is that the GPS on your drone, unless you've purchased a drone with an RTK GPS for several thousands of dollars, that GPS on your drone has an accuracy of plus or minus 5 meters in terms of its location when it tags each individual photo. Now, what this means at the end of the process is when you create your map, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be in the correct location. So what we do there is to put out field data points to make sure that we can move our imagery to be in the right spot. It's super important to do, particularly if you're looking at changes over time, because you want to make sure that the environment itself is changing, not just your image being shifted. Now, other examples here. So it's also Javier in the middle image, and he's creating some three-dimensional models of the underwater environment, just as we'll do from the drone. And Dr. Stephanie Joyce from JCU up on the left-hand side there is putting out some similar control points on the reef there as well. So we've also taken GPS locations of their floppy hats, nice big broad brim hats, and we can see those in the imagery, which you saw from the previous photo that I popped up. And we also know exactly what it is on that location. So we know that there's a live coral just there. So when we have a look at the drone photo, we know for sure where our live coral is, and that's going to help us later when we calibrate and validate mapping models. Okay, so tip number 2, you want to get up close and personal to the environment in which you're working, and don't just rely on the fact that Droney can head off and get you information in areas where you can't necessarily access. All right, tip number 3, you absolutely need to be app flexible. There is no single app that's going to do everything that you need to do. And this can be really quite overwhelming when you start to get into drones. Now, if you want to just take happy snaps with your drone, that can work just using, if you're using a DJI product, for example, you might just use the DJI Go app, all right? But then when we want to start thinking about creating maps, we want something that is going to do mission planning for us, something that is going to stitch together the photos at the end. And now there are some companies that are combining those two together, which does make that workflow a little simpler if that's the combination that you want to use. And then finally, your analysis product as well. So whether that be a GIS or some form of image processing system as well. Now, there are so many different options. And there, in my opinion, there is no one option that is the best for everything. So sometimes it will depend on the drone that I'm flying. So some apps are Android only, some are iOS only. Some apps will work with DJI products, others work with other types of drones. And when you've got a mix within your fleet, you really need to be fluent on using all these different types of apps and moving between them as well. And this is something that I find can be super overwhelming to understand exactly which app to use at which part of your workflow and under which circumstances might you need to change to something else. So that's tip number 3. I really think you need to just get comfortable with the fact that there's no one app that's going to do everything for you, and you need to pick up the digital literacy skills in some instances to understand exactly how you're going to move between those different apps and pieces of software as part of your workflow. All right, so our 3 tips. We had, you can't out-process poor data collection. You need to be app flexible, and you need to get up close and personal to the environment in which you're working. 3 things that I don't believe really come across in the drone training, and for very good reason as well.
So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the masterclass. And if you'd like to learn more about the ins and outs of these top tips, as well as plenty more, why don't you come along and join us in our drone mapping course. So you'll learn all about your data capture and mission planning, along with field survey, pre-processing, creating orthomosaics and 3-dimensional models, all the way through to communicating your information using GIS and mapping.